Hello, everyone. I think we'll begin now. For any latecomers, we do record the webinar, so we will publish it after the event. But hello, and welcome to the 13th webinar of the Grievance, Redress, and Accountability Mechanism Partnership, also known as the GRAM Partnership. I'm Peter Carlson, the Communications Officer at the Independent Redress Mechanism of the Green Climate Fund. Before we begin, I wanted to just remind you about a few administrative matters. This is a public meeting where you can see the other participants on the call. So if you wanted to join anonymously, you can do so by changing your name, by clicking, I think if you click on the dots next to your name, and I think it should allow you to rename yourself if you so wish. We do ask you to mute your microphones during the call, but if you wanted to keep your video on, feel free to do so you can see the other individuals who have joined this webinar. And as I mentioned, this will be recorded and published on our website, hopefully next week. At the end of the workshop, or at the end of the webinar, sorry, we will share a survey with you. Actually, we might put that survey link into the chat now and then as well at the end. So that is a few just administrative things I wanted to share with you. For those of you that are new to the Grant Partnership, welcome. The Grant Partnership was founded in 2019 by the IRM, the Black Sea Trade and Development Bank, and the Social and Environmental Compliance Unit, also known as SECU, of the United Nations Development Program. The Grant Partnership is a learning and knowledge platform, as well as a meeting space to share information around grievance redress and accountability issues. It's open to interested grievance mechanisms, academic institutions, civil society organizations, and other individuals who are interested in the field. If you'd like more information about this partnership, if you'd like to become a member, or if you'd like to watch all of our previous webinars and recordings, we invite you to visit our website at irm.greenclimate.fund/grant partnership, and we'll put that in the chat as well. So to begin today's webinar, many individuals adversely affected by development projects, grievance redress and accountability mechanisms serve as vital channels for raising concerns and seeking remedy. These mechanisms ensure that the voices of impacted communities are heard and their grievances adequately addressed. Civil society organizations play an essential role in this grievance process. They raise awareness about grievance mechanisms, provide support to affected communities in navigating the complaint process, and advocate for fair resolutions. CSOs also contribute to strengthening accountability by ensuring transparency and monitoring the implementation of remedial actions. In this 13th webinar of the Grant Partnership, we will explore the grievance redress process from the perspective of civil society. The discussion will focus on how CSOs view issues around accessibility, process, retaliation, and remedy, as well as the overall engagement with grievance redress and accountability mechanisms to achieve effective and just outcomes. So if we move to the next slide, I will present our panelists for today's discussion. We have my colleague Preksha Kumar, who's a registrar and case officer at the IRM. She oversees the complaint registration and eligibility determination process, and she has extensive experience in international human rights, advocacy, accountability, and redress mechanisms in development finance. Next, we have Prabin Shakya, who's a founder and director of the Community Empowerment and Social Justice Network, and the convener of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Network on Extractive Industries and Energy. For over a decade, he has actively engaged in NGO advocacy work for marginalized groups, focusing on indigenous rights, social justice, and environmental and development justice in Nepal and throughout Asia. Our next panelist, Ryan Hassan, is the Executive Director of the NGO Forum on ADB, the Asian Development Bank. This is a regional civil society network with 250 members. Under his leadership, the NGO Forum on ADB has become a prominent advocate for sustainable development and social justice in Asia. He's a seasoned development scholar and practitioner focused on civil society networking and campaigning for environmental and social justice concerning international financial institutions or multilateral development banks across Asia. Rayan has led policy advocacy and dialogues with the World Bank, the European Commission, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and has conducted extensive research on development financing in Asia. Our next panelist, Tala Batangen, is the Asia Regional Coordinator for the Coalition for Human Rights and Development, a global South-led coalition of social movements, CSOs, and grassroots groups working towards rights-based and community-led development. The coalition does this by making sure that communities have the information, power, and resources to determine their own development paths and priorities, and to hold development finance institutions, governments, and other actors accountable for their impacts on people and the planet. Tunga Ray, our last panelist here, is the director of the Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities Climate Change Partnership Program. For over 2 decades, he has advocated for Indigenous rights, community empowerment, and policy changes to promote self-determination and cultural preservation for Nepal's Indigenous communities. His advocacy efforts have contributed to significant policy changes, including recognizing Indigenous people's rights in Nepal's constitution. So thank you, panelists, for joining us for today's discussion. If we move to the next slide, I'll walk everyone through our agenda. First, we will have my colleague Prashant Kumar provide an overview of at least how the IRM handles our complaint handling process, and then the subsequent role of civil society within this. And then we'll get into our panel discussion, asking 2 main questions and looking at how accessibility, the process, retaliation, and remedy are experienced, and how they're dealt with by civil society organizations. And at the very end, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers with the participants here and the panelists. So with that, we will move on to our next slide, and I will hand it over to Preksha.
Thank you, Peter. Just before we begin, I did want to emphasize, I think, just agenda setting. I think we can't talk about accountability mechanisms and grievance mechanisms, their history, their establishment, without really talking about civil society activism, protests, and movements. And I'm borrowing here from the inspection panel retrospective at 25, which really dives quite deep into the circumstances around which the panel was created over 30 years ago now. And a big part of that was financing for a dam in India that was displacing 120,000 people, and the social movements and civil society kind of interventions that emerged as a result of these unaccounted for impacts on people, communities, livelihoods, entire environments and ecosystems. And one of the very, I think, idealistic promises that accountability mechanisms provide is also that this is very much citizen-based, where international financial institutions are accountable not merely to national interests, but to civil society, to the public, to citizens. And I think that that is something that is a very valuable principle and core central function of why accountability mechanisms are needed, not merely from the perspective of improving project processing and operations, but also to promote accountability, transparency, and better development outcomes for people, as well as to ensure there are no further harms to the environment. So that's the larger, I think, agenda setting. All accountability mechanisms, grievance redress mechanisms in the last 30 years have kind of evolved from this model of creating a space for complaints to be handled impartially, responsibly, and with all relevant stakeholders involved. So if you go to the next slide. So the IRM, as one of the younger accountability mechanisms, one of the things that we have, I think, learned from all the reviews of various accountability mechanisms is that the role of civil society is very important, and one that can't just be excluded on the basis that, certain people have legitimacy, others don't. So for example, in the IRM's eligibility criteria, we allow for project-affected peoples to designate a civil society organization as their representative. That's not universal amongst all accountability mechanisms, and different institutions decide how they want to navigate that. But for the IRM, it's one of the things that we are able to provide as ability for complainants themselves who may or may not be conversant with international financial institutions and their various processes, and instead turn to civil society organizations or NGOs or unions or any other group that has a strong public interest to take forward some of these concerns. And what does that mean? In the case handling process, that means in whichever process that we take, either problem solving or compliance review, there's varying degrees in which a civil society organization partnered with affected communities may be involved in the handling of the case and reaching kind of a resolution, problem-solving agreement, if we're talking about dispute resolution, or in compliance review. One of the core functions of, I think, civil society in this way is in this regard is we really do rely on civil society to also surface for us information that may not be officially documented within, what is a project documentation, what is existing in the realm of what we know and an institutional perspective, but potentially very essential context that comes from both practice and also being connected to people on the ground. This is very important in terms of making sure we take into account all relevant facts that are part of processing a complaint. And of course, monitoring. Monitoring is the final kind of stage that makes any resolution, any implementation of remediation actually have any teeth and take forward. And in our monitoring processes, and GCF itself has, I'm trying not to talk too much about the GCF and I'll focus mostly on the IRM, but one of the highlights that I think of the GCF's policy is that it allows for participatory monitoring in the implementation of activities, and that specifically considers civil society as part of that. So there are various ways in which civil society can be involved, either in kind of the project cycle, but certainly for the IRM, there is a formal role, and broadly there can be an informal role, either through board meetings where civil society observers are able to publicly comment on any relevant developments or concerns that they see, and those are also something that the IRM takes into account, especially if it relates to environmental and social safeguards concerns. All right, if we can go to the next slide. So if I had to really reduce civil society into a table that's easily digestible, for the IRM, we're actually able to engage with civil society on a number of fronts, not just in terms of as, representation. So either as community-based CSOs, reaching out on the basis of complaints, or legal assistance CSOs. Many CSOs provide legal advice for communities who seek to enter a complaints handling process, which can often be quite technical. We also rely on civil society for, the role that they play in monitoring and looking at the functioning or the results and impacts of projects on the ground. It's very hard to get real-time information, especially if you're sitting in South Korea, far away. But without impartial kind of press, or even in the absence of a press that's very keen on some local issues, I know journalism is not doing so well these days, civil society plays a very critical role in providing a kind of check and balance. And we rely on those kinds of interventions. The IRM is also able to initiate its own complaints in the absence of complainants. And in the very first case that the IRM did so, it relied on civil society authored publications, academic publications and civil society authored publications. And those were raised very credible risks that then the IRM determined are substantial enough for us to move forward. In case handling, of course, there's participation on the basis of representation, persistence, and also in monitoring and serving a public accountability role. So in broad strokes, these are the ways in which civil society can get involved in a complaints handling process. and one in which I think the IRM and our philosophy and our practice as a learning institution definitely welcome, because through the criticisms as well as the kind of signals that civil society shares with us, we're able to also do our job better. And that's a very important, I think, dynamic, and one in which that makes us a more effective grievance mechanism. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell how the IRM interacts with civil society organizations in our complaints handling process.
Thank you, Praksha, for this really concise overview on the way in which the IRM handles our complaints, and then especially those interactions and touch points that we have with civil society. I think this kind of outlines um, well how civil society and accountability mechanisms can engage. But now we want to transition and get over to the viewpoints of civil society. So if we move to the next slide, we're going to ask two questions. And we have our panelists who are going to provide their insights and views based off of these four thematic areas of accessibility, the entire process with Prescia, Windhover, issues that CSOs experience in retaliation, and then also remedy. So for the first question, we wanted to highlight what challenges do civil societies encounter when engaging with grievance redress and accountability mechanisms. And so maybe we'll start first with accessibility. So I'll pass the floor over to our panelists who will be focusing on accessibility.
Thanks. Thank you, Peter. I think I'll take on from there. Yeah.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Dozalopa. Namaste. This is Praveen. I identify myself as an indigenous human rights defender. I belong to indigenous Nyewa people. We are the natives of Kathmandu Valley and some surrounding areas in Nepal. And firstly, thank you to GCF and GRAM for having me and CSOs to share our experiences in this webinar. So in terms of accessibility, I'll be sharing my experiences as, the challenges for accessibility. I'll be sharing my experiences from supporting indigenous Newa and other local communities affected by the World Bank Finance Chobar dry port in south of Kathmandu, as well as indigenous Magar and other local communities affected by Tanohu hydropower project co-financed by the Asian Development Bank, European Investment Bank, and Japan International Cooperation Agency in Western Nepal. In both these cases, I, in my personal capacity or as SEMSOs, are working with the communities as an advisor, in the complaint processes for the affected communities. While one of the complaint has already been closed, actually did not move into investigation. So I would like to highlight four key challenges in particular. The first one is that, and first one I think, and this is the most important one, that there is dearth of awareness about these grievance and accountability mechanisms, about the existence of these mechanisms, as well as the safeguard policies that these mechanisms seek to ensure compliance of. Yeah. And the lack of awareness is particularly vivid or evident at the level of affected communities, where there really needs to be this awareness. Yeah. And when CSOs or defenders such as us go to these communities to inform them that these policies exist, these mechanisms exist for them to access, to seek remedy, we are often tagged as anti-development, anti-national, so that's another level of challenge. We as CSOs also face challenge because the disclosures of many institutions, financial institutions such as IFC, are not very user-friendly. So, even when we try to access information about these projects that might be concerning to communities that we serve, it's not very easy to come. So I think that's the initial and then most important challenge. The second part, or the second challenge, when communities decide to pursue remedy through these pursue complaint to these grievance redress and accountability mechanisms, is with regards to language and technological barriers. Yeah, so of course these mechanisms are not always existent at the national level. They are far away. Language is going to be an issue. Access to technological know-how to email them their complaints is going to be an issue. But at the same time, more importantly, the procedural barriers is a bigger issue. Communities don't always are aware about the sequencing the sequencing of dispute resolution and compliance review functions of these mechanisms. And that has often been that has often been a challenge, whereby communities are often discouraged to seek remedy or to file complaints with these mechanisms, because they would first want to have some compliance or non-compliance established before getting into dispute resolution. At the same time, the other procedural barrier is the requirement for good faith effort or prior good faith effort that many of these mechanisms have, which also often result in non-admissibility of complaints filed to these mechanisms. Thirdly, the challenge is that, and this is particularly based on the experience of working with indigenous communities affected by Tanahu hydropower project, which is co-financed project. There are multiple mechanisms. Yeah, each each institution has their own mechanism with their own mandate and their own policies, or with their own procedures, and this often is confusing and not something that communities can easily grapple with. And even CSOs have to learn by experience, like how let's say an accountability mechanism at ADB works and the complaint mechanism at the European Investment Bank works. Yeah, so that is also a challenge for communities as well as CSOs to get used to all these mechanisms, and their different policies and procedures. And working with these mechanisms, what we have often felt is, like, although free, prior, indigenous communities, like, the ones that we work with, demand free, prior, and informed consent, no respect for their free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, for decisions affecting them. Often these mechanisms also do not follow the principle of FPIC in their working. These mechanisms often hire consultants without even consulting with the complainants or their advisors. Their timelines are not always consulted with the communities or their advisors or the CSOs, and that also creates a challenge or presents a challenge. Finally, and I think this is also key, is the lack of effectiveness of the mechanisms, of the safeguards that they monitor, particularly to provide access to remedy, like effective remedy, or like remedy on the visible, or like physical remedy. We have seen that all those safeguards of many mechanisms are of higher standard than national legal framework. The safeguards are still not in line with international human rights standards, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for the requirements for FPIC, for the when FPIC is required. So for the requirements about FPIC. Worse, for institutions such as Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the safeguard policy still does not even require FPIC. It's only consultations that the safeguards require. Yeah. So that when these safeguards are not in line with the international human rights standards, that does not encourage the communities to access these mechanisms. Secondly, the second part of it is that these mechanisms, accountability mechanisms in particular of the banks, multilateral development banks, do not result in immediate remedy, such as even temporary suspension of financing that the communities often seek, when they present their credible complaint of non-compliance of the safeguards. And this is particularly important, like such suspension of financing is particularly important when there is evidence that continued financing can cause further harms to the communities or their defenders. But that is often not within the mandate of these accountability mechanisms, or not always in the mandate of these mechanisms. And finally, often providing remedy is sidelined, or is appointed as the responsibility of the implementing entity, rather than the financier, or the accountability mechanism itself. So that is also a challenge. Yeah, that they cannot seek remedy from the financial institution, or or the accountability mechanism itself. And what we have seen, particularly with the grievance mechanisms at the operational level, is that these mechanisms, particularly, all the mechanisms that we have seen are not in line with the effectiveness criteria of the UN guiding principles. So that is often where, the first level of challenge start, and that multiplies at various levels. No, so I think I'll focus on these 4 challenges. I hope that was useful, and back to you, Peter.
Great. Thank you, Bradman. I think that outlines very well some of what also some of the other panelists will talk about, especially in terms of the process and remedy. I think accessibility is critically important for mechanisms, accountability and grievance redress mechanisms to keep in mind, because obviously if you don't know that this mechanism exists in the first place, how is someone going to know that they could file a complaint with you? So increasing visibility, increasing awareness, I think is especially at the IRM, is on the top of our radar in terms of making sure that we are as accessible as possible. Obviously, you outlined some of these challenges in terms of the language accessibility, technology accessibility. And so I think there's a lot of work for us to continue to be doing in order to help reach communities. Coming over to the process, which you also touched on briefly, I'm going to hand the floor over to Rayan to walk us through some of the challenges that he sees that civil society encounters when they're engaging with grants. So over to you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to GCF for inviting the NGO Forum on ADB and the GRAM partnership. So picking up from where Praveen left, and he made a very, very important point, it is that the mechanisms are extremely, extremely technical when you look at it from the perspective of affected communities and civil society. And I don't want to sound too much on the nose. Sometimes the mechanisms feel like they're lost in their own sauce a little bit in terms of their processes when you talk to them. So there is a complaint receiving officer, and then they have these processes of number of days and how they're going to interact with management, how do they interact with the board. And when we're talking to the mechanisms, we have these long conversations where it's all about them and how difficult it is to move the files around, right, in the machinery of the bank. And it's not about the complainants, and it's not about the impacts on the project. And it takes a long time for those conversations to move from bank facing to ground facing. So that's something which from the forum over the years we've felt. And it takes a while, and it takes a lot of experience from people who work within the bank, within the mechanisms, to actually address the issues on the ground quicker. And I think there's a question of having people with ground experience in mechanisms is absolutely critical for an effective mechanism to function. Saying that, my main points would probably be, I'll focus on 3 things. The first one will be processing time. Processing time is the fundamental issue for complainants. If we are talking to complainants as civil society, the first thing they're going to ask us is, when is their problem going to be solved? And I'll just give you a few examples here from the ADB. The Cambodia Railway Rehabilitation Project, from all the way to problem-solving function to CRP to remedial action plan, it took 8 years. It took 8 years, and it just cost civil society, I think, over $150,000 to maintain that advocacy. And who's going to bear that cost, right? It has nothing to do with the mechanism. That's just the cost of the advocacy, of flying people to headquarters and attending meetings and going through consultations. So 8 years is a long time for people to get their problem solved. Tata Mundra was one of the fastest, where the compliance review panel of the ADB managed to get an investigation report, and that too took 3 years. 3 years. The project which we are all working on, the Tanahu project, which Praveen mentioned, the first OSPF complaint was filed in 2020. Today it's 2025, and we still don't have a remedial action plan worth bringing the problem solved. And now we're thinking of additional complaints and so on and so forth. So the question which ends up being asked by civil society as well as communities is, if it's going to take so long, why will we trust the mechanism? right? And that is very difficult for us to convince to the communities that this is an avenue that you want to pursue because there is going to be some kind of remedy here. But the way the things are going in terms of timeline, it's very scary. So one more point here on time, and there's a recent example. We filed a problem-solving function complaint at the AIIB PPM, and we dotted the I's and we crossed the T's and we kept everyone's name anonymous and we did all that. Eligibility, decision-making, and response as per the AIB PPM policy should not have taken more than 35 days to happen. But in actual experience, it took them 10 months and 29 days to come up with the decision for ineligibility. I won't go into why it was ineligible. I am just focusing on the time issue here. The policy says 35 days, you'll get an answer. It took them 10 months and 29 days. So here, the question is, if the mechanism is not following its own processes in time, isn't that a violation of its own policy? Then where do you go for justice on that? So it seems mechanisms can make mistakes and we as civil society should be okay with it. But if, for example, the wrong form gets filled out or a little information in one of the complaint processes is misspelled and the entire complaint is deemed ineligible, then I guess the rules apply very differently when it comes to the communities, but the same rules of due diligence do not apply to the bank when it's looking at its own policies. Sorry to sound too harsh, but those are the realities that we deal with. The second point I want to bring is on-field consultations during complaints. When mechanisms get on the ground, most mechanisms have a willingness to get on the ground. But when the consultations start to happen, you notice there's a lot of challenges which start manifesting, which you don't anticipate. The first one is choice of venues. Mechanisms end up wanting to have a safe and secure environment where they can have a conversation with the communities. Communities want a different kind of expectation. They want mechanisms to see where the problem is and to really get to the ground. And the choice of venue becomes a battleground. And we as civil society have to convince the mechanism to really get to the project site. And not all mechanisms are forthright in wanting to do that. And we've had their mechanisms have invited complainants to come to very fancy hotels in India during Tata Mundra. During that case, and the communities and the affected communities really did not want to go in that kind of an environment and meet with the borrowers because it was high risk and very, very costly. In some cases, mechanisms said, oh, we don't feel safe if we go to the communities. And it's our job as civil society to basically ensure their security and also to ensure the fact that they are going to be perceived openly and interacted to with trust. So I know it goes both ways, but where do the resources lie here? I think a bank's mechanism has the resources to mobilize translators, transport, and get to the project site. And I think the onus is on the mechanism to meet that, to meet the communities where they are, and to create an environment where an open conversation without risk of retaliation can take place. The last point for me would be down to the remedial action plan. I think that's where the next inputs will come in, but the only point which I want to touch upon on process of remedial action plan is on the issue of the monitoring. See, when the complaint is being filed and the mechanism starts investigating, the investigation process requires communities to talk and interact with the mechanisms extensively, regardless of all the challenges. There will be multiple meetings, right? And a trust and a sense of rapport is built between the mechanism and the community. But we have seen in the ADB, the remedial action plan is designed by management, implemented by management and borrower. So the same two groups which caused the problem are the ones who are now going to solve it. And then when we ask the mechanism, what is your role here? We get different views from the ADB, problem-solving function does not have a monitoring function of the remedial action plan, whereas compliance review panel may have a field site monitoring option. I might be wrong here, but I'm assuming CRP gets on the ground. Now, this varies mechanisms to mechanisms. If you look at this from the community and the complainant side, they would want those who they complain to, those who dealt in the bank with their complaint, to be in charge of making sure that the remedial action plan is delivered point for point, provided they also had a chance to have their say in the remedial action plan. So those are my few points on process, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rand, for highlighting some of these issues. I think processing time, your point on that is very tantamount, especially in terms of how mechanisms can make sure that they keep the trust with complainants as the medium to come and have resolved their complaints. And if processing time takes years upon years, then I could very much put myself in the shoes of a complainant and see what am I doing with this process and with this mechanism if I'm not going to get anything in a timely, efficient manner. So let's move on to retaliation. I think this is also something that a lot of civil society organizations deal with in terms of possible retaliatory measures that could occur, especially engaging on issues such as advocacy or human rights or environmental protections. I even at the beginning of this call said that you could, change your name in the participant list if you felt like there could possibly be a possible retaliatory issue if it's known that you're participating in this call, for example. So I think there are lots of issues that can arise, and we'd love to hear more from your experience, Tala, from the Coalition for Human Rights and Development. So over to you.
Thanks, Peter. And thanks also to the GCF and the GRAM for inviting the coalition to this important discussion. The inputs and sharing that I'll also be giving today also comes from our work and conversations and discussions with human rights defenders that we work with closely in the coalition and also in the Defenders in Development campaign. So just to give also a brief background, one of the programs of the coalition is the DID campaign, which we also work specifically on reprisal risks and civic space issues in the context of development finance institutions. So in relation to what we are talking about on the challenges in engaging with grants, I think I'll also expound on what Prabin and Ryan has already said. But one big challenge that civil society and communities and defenders face when approaching these mechanisms is really the trend of shrinking civic space globally. So I think it has come up in conversations a lot with development actors, with banks, and we see that especially in Asia, there's really a trend where a lot of countries have been closing up and freedoms are being restricted. And that also impacts the work that defenders and communities do in relation to development projects being financed by multilateral development banks and DFIs. You see that there's a passing of restrictive laws for civil society, criminalization of activists, communities and families that are working on development projects that impact their lives and environment. And we also see that as a major hindrance to the bank also contributing to its aims of positive development outcomes and meaningful stakeholder engagement, because in a closed, restricted civic space context, you won't be able to rely on the community to share freely on what the negative impacts and the harm that the projects can do to their communities, to their livelihoods, and to their environment. A recent research done by the Defenders in Development campaign showed that from 2019 to 2023, multilateral development banks have actually invested in 18 countries with closed civic space, and the total amount of that amounts to $88 billion. And so if we see that $88 billion going to restricted civic space context, we're not sure that those investments actually contribute to those to the proposed development outcomes that they are suggesting in the project documents, right? And we're not also ensuring that there is mechanisms available for communities to approach in these cases when there is harm being faced by these communities. I guess also in the context of GCF, in the context of climate and energy projects, there is also a trend of more risks being faced by environmental defenders as they confront threats to their land, their communities, their culture, and environment. So it's also being more pronounced now that there are more climate and energy projects that are for the sake of, climate, resiliency, just energy transition, but are in direct conflict with human rights. The second one, I think Prabin also touched upon it earlier, is a lack of information and transparency. So if communities don't know who is funding this project, they're not able to know which mechanisms are available to them. And in the case of retaliation, if they don't know, there are security measures in place like confidentiality, anonymity, or other protocols that the bank can secure defenders to ensure that their safety and security is being maintained while they do engage in these processes. They won't approach the mechanism at all because it also exposes them to more risks. A third one is we also see that there is conflict of interest. Like, I know accountability mechanisms are supposed to be independent, but sometimes with good faith efforts as well, with that requirement, they also require communities to approach, project officers before, or project level grievance redress mechanisms that are being housed in governments or their private sector clients. And you see that given there is a conflict of interest there when these governments and clients want the project to move forward because it's part of their work, right? And it's part of their outcomes. And they would resort to retaliations and attacks to stop the complaints from being filed or from being taken on by the bank or other mechanisms. So there is that conflict of interest as well when we do require communities to approach other mechanisms that are not as independent as accountability mechanisms should be. We also see that during the complaint process, there are different risks that arise. So even before they approach the grievance redress and accountability mechanism, there are already risks because once they file a complaint, they are being identified. It's easier to target them, and it's easier for the officials that have vested interest in the project to continue to know who is opposing that project. But also within the investigation process, as Ryan also mentioned, when they do site visits, there's also that threat of retaliation. Especially, we also see that when banks do site visits, once they leave the site, it also exposes these communities to heightened risks because they know that, oh, you filed this this complaint to this mechanism and you're opposing this project, and etc. etc. So I think it has to be those challenges that defenders already foresee when even before filing the complaint, that also deters them from approaching the complaint mechanism. And lastly, I think this is a big and I think Ryan also mentioned this earlier, it's a big word. There's really a lack of trust within these mechanisms, especially for defenders. There should be a certain degree of trust for them to approach these mechanisms, that they are being ensured that they are safe, they are secure when they do engage with these mechanisms. And if these mechanisms do not have that capacity, or you do not have the commitment to protect the defenders and communities that are approaching them, they will be scared to approach the mechanism at all. And I think it also comes up also from experiences of other communities as well, right? When there are experiences of retaliation and reprisals and the bank doesn't do anything when these cases arise, it also impacts how they perceive the mechanism and the bank on how they view communities and defenders. We also see that even we know that mechanisms have a limited function. They also can't act as rapidly as we hoped that they can act on. But I think there's really need for accountability mechanisms to have a more rapid response in terms of time-bound issues, especially in cases of retaliation, because we can't we can't be in a super structured in that sense that they have to file a complaint first. They have to, go through the process first before we act on, threats and attacks faced by defenders. We also see that banks also rarely talk about reprisals in a public manner. A lot of it is also discussed in more close discussions, and that's helpful for security purposes. But we also need the bank to speak out and really apply its zero tolerance statement to reprisals and retaliation to its clients and its partners in these development projects. So I'll stop there and open to discussing more. Thanks.
Thanks, Tala, for highlighting some of these issues, especially what you started with in terms of the shrinking civic space that I think a lot of countries unfortunately are experiencing, and the lack of, I guess, an environment that allows them to be on the front lines in terms of advocacy, in terms of defending community rights, and the risks that civil society often faces if they are even helping engage in the sort of process that the grants kind of offer. It's interesting how you linked, especially some of these issues, so the processing time and how an extended time of process could perhaps have increased exposure and possible risk to a civil society organization or to a community. The longer that something's drawn out, the more time there is possibly for instances to occur. So it's interesting how a lot of these we're seeing are interlinked. I want to move on to our last topic that we're going to discuss in terms of remedy. So I'll pass the floor over to Tunga.
Namaste, everyone. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, IRM, and it's nice to see some of the familiar faces. I will keep my intervention within 5 minutes given time. Hopefully, I will do that. So, as our previous speakers already highlighted, that most of the intervention, not most of the, all of the intervention comes in the name of so-called development, biodiversity conservation, or climate action in case of GCF, if I have to say. And then imagine how difficult it is to seek remedy for any negative impact or grievances against communities. And I can speak more for Indigenous people since I work with Indigenous peoples and I belong to Indigenous Rai people of Nepal. So sometimes, to speak from own experience, it feels like Indigenous peoples and those investors live in different world, different planet, because we see things very differently, and how we see nature and environment is so different from how the investors and the big companies, MDBs, and even UN agencies see those things. So having said that, when it comes to remedy, the most important thing we realize, and the very big gap we realize, is that the remedy comes from whose eye and whose interpretation and whose perspective. So it's often like led by mainstream value lauded. Even if there is some remedy provided to some grievances, then it rarely addresses the distinct worldviews, distinct lifeways, and distinct need and distinct perspective of Indigenous peoples, right? It's so difficult for them to get into that deeper level of perception and deeper level of impact of any intervention where the grievances are coming from. For example, most of the remedies I can see is mostly from the economic value loaded perspective, how a project can compensate the damage from economic perspective, but we rarely find how some of the grievances are coming from non-economic damages of the intervention, how intangible damages can be addressed along the way the grievances are addressed, right? So for Indigenous peoples, really the relationships with the land, with the territories, and with the ancestral domains are very, very important. And the history, the knowledge systems, and our recollections and our perception connected with those land and territories are very difficult to express and also very difficult to compensate, very difficult to bring it to the remedial discussions. It's really difficult to make people realize it in a proper way and also in a correct way and also in the same level of the depth that we feel and we feel about it, right? So having said that, what I'm trying to highlight here is the remedies also need to be really culture friendly and commensurate to the multiple dimension of the impact of in intervention. Most oftentimes we find people are seeking remedies from economic point of views, economic values, but they really fail to deep dive into other dimensions, social, cultural, spiritual, and environmental dimension of the impact. So then how this is a persistent challenge for indigenous peoples, I think precisely it's the lack of representation and participation and the lack of voice even in the process of grievance redress mechanisms. For example, the customary institution, customary leaders, indigenous way of problem solving, indigenous conflict resolution systems are often represented, often rarely represented and rarely addressed along the process. So there are a lot of indigenous peoples organizations working on the ground and, feeling that from a very, very rooted experience, but those organizations and institutions sometimes are not in the process of setting up any remedy against some negative impact, right? So I'm saying here institution very purposefully because indigenous organizations are not organizations as a modern organization in many cases. It's an institution, it's a practice, it operates in customary way. It doesn't have a written constitution, but it has a very traditional and customary value and protocols that really keeps this kind of institution holding for many, many years. But how these type of existing realities are also considered as a very important actor in grievance handling mechanism is also very important. And there comes the communication tools and language issues also. If we're really trying to bring those kind of institution on board, then what is the medium of your communication? What are the tools of your communication? Are they really kind of friendly to those institutions and individuals? That's very important. And we see a lot of times the big MDVs, UN agencies, big conservation NGOs coming with some commitments when there is some grievances or complaints against some intervention. But what we often realize is that also there is a lack of good faith negotiation. Sometimes it's taken as a just checkbox practice and they commit certain things. For example, they also develop indigenous people's plan as their commitment, but how they hold their accountability to fulfill their promises included in indigenous people's plan. We have seen in Nepal some of the hydropower projects have committed to fund indigenous people's plan, committed certain amount of money, but they really don't operate those indigenous people's plan in an indigenous way. They again impose the conventional way of project management, and so so there is the challenge, how we can change those whole paradigm of handling with grievances and grievance redress mechanism, remedy, and a lot of those things from also multiple dimension and disciplines. For indigenous peoples, it's really different world. As I said, we see the world from different dimension and we see it differently. We find it different thing within one single domain. Like Redress means different thing for different people. For some people, it's a sacred element. For some people, it's a source of hydropower project and turning it into clean energy. So I think there are these kind of multiple deeper level of conversation also we need to get into when we talk about the remedy of this kind of grievances. I think I stop here for now. Yeah, thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Tanga. I was particularly drawn to what you said about the relationship that especially indigenous peoples have with their territory and with their surroundings, and how it's very difficult to define compensation, and how it's not just economic, and there's a lot of other complex things that should be taken into account, such as the social, cultural, and spiritual aspects of communities, especially indigenous communities. So thank you for highlighting some of those things. We wanted, with question number 2, if we can move to the next slide, to understand, especially from our perspective of a grievance redress mechanism, what we can do as mechanisms to help improve some of these challenges that you've just talked about in the first question, and exactly what you would look at as kind of a best practice for a mechanism to have in order to make us as effective as possible. So coming back to these thematic areas, we'll start first with accessibility with Pravin. If you can highlight some of the things that you would in an ideal world like to see.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks again, Peter. I think what GRAM could do, or individual grievance redress and accountability mechanisms could do with regards to enhancing accessibility for affected communities, for civil society. There are 3 points that I would like to make, and I think these are in relation to the challenges that I highlighted earlier. Firstly, again, the key is raising awareness. Yeah. GRAM as a collective or individual grievance redress and accountability mechanisms need to put more effort, more resources, more energy to raise awareness about their existence, about the safeguards that they ensured compliance of. And this should not only be at international levels, or on the sidelines of an international meeting, but this should actually happen at national and local levels, and particularly in situ with the project affected communities, or the potentially the communities that are concerned by the project. We would like to see that these awareness raising activities are proactive, proactively undertaken by the mechanisms. But at the same time, I think there should be a mandatory requirement for the projects themselves, for the institutions themselves, that there should be a mandatory requirement for the institutions or the project management, that they also make the communities aware about these safeguards and existence of the mechanisms. Yeah, so it should be a joint effort between the mechanisms and the project or the institution altogether. Secondly, I think they are already among the GRAM membership, as well as among the IAM Net International Accountability Mechanisms Network membership. There are already number of mechanisms that have stronger standards than the other one. So what we have also been calling for these collectives is to undertake like peer review among accountability mechanisms, to push for policy reforms within their institutions, that their fellow mechanisms already have these stronger standards, so they should have it too, right? So I think that's one thing that they should do. And I think accountability mechanisms of the institutions should have also a stronger role when when the banks themselves, or when the institutions themselves are improving or revising their safeguard policies. Yeah, one thing that we see is a good practice is this policy of self-initiation that some accountability mechanisms have. Yeah, that they can already proactively take on a complaint based on information, without complainants having to file a complaint itself. I think that should be a standard practice among many mechanisms, not just that particular mechanism. Yeah. So yeah, definitely the accountability mechanisms need to do more push for more policy reforms, and including for project disclosures. Again, as I said, the project disclosure is one of the key challenges. We need to be able to find out easily where the money from the banks or the institutions are going from their website at the national level, and even at the even from our national media or local media. Finally, I think we are all going through, when we talk with accountability mechanisms, we all know that there is resource crunch, right? So I think we need to pull in our resources, collectively, mobilize our resources to engage, engage between the accountability mechanisms and CSOs and affected communities, so that we can share our experiences, share our challenges, and collectively find solutions to those challenges, no, and have a race to the top. Yeah, I mean, to continuously try to improve ourselves, no, how we work with each other. So, of course, it's not be just accountability mechanisms talking among each other all the time. They should also engage with the civil society. And I think in the last independent accountability mechanisms network meeting, IAM net meeting, we have made a step towards it by trying to start a joint working group, particularly to look at retaliations. I think we need to have more such joint effort between accountability mechanisms, GRAM, IAMNet, and civil society, so that we help each other, we support each other. I stop there. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Pravin, for highlighting these possible ways forward, especially I think the idea of collaboration, sharing resources, sharing expertise, pulling these together to really help engage with especially communities, but then also on other issues, as you mentioned, as retaliation. I think that's particularly important for us to think about as we move forward on how to improve accessibility for communities. Let's move on to the GRAM processes. So I'll pass the floor over to Ryan.
Thank you, Peter. This time around, three main points. The first one is we would definitely appreciate the mechanisms leveling the playing field between the complainants and the project developers and bank management. And when I say leveling the playing field, I mean structurally throughout the complaint process. Consultation processes should be fair. The agenda setting should be inclusive. The venue selection has to be inclusive. The hiring of all forms of ancillary agents and mediators and translators and point focals, all of them has to be done in an inclusive manner where the complainants are giving free, prior, informed consent that these are the people that we're going to work with. And lastly, any formation of committees or subcommittees during the complaint process, all those committees should have affected communities represented in a manner where the power dynamic is ensured that they can freely speak and give their opinions, and their decisions will be factored in. So that's what I mean by leveling the playing field. The second point here is to reduce at the same time as much red tape as possible to ensure that safety and security for coercion-free dialogue can take place during the process. Because once the investigation starts, if people cannot tell their truth, then the investigation will not have the findings necessary to lead to a good remedial action plan. So the entire process of investigation must ensure that you reduce additional burdens on the complainants in order to extract the information from them. So that means if you're in the field and you want to have a consultation, make sure you know what is their timing of their livelihoods. You don't want them to compromise on going to the farms or going out for work and showing up there, and then they have to pull away from that. And that's a huge cost. And we've seen this time and time again on complainants where the investigation happens on its own timeline and is absolutely non-cognizant of the reality of the complainants' livelihoods and their lifestyles. And then you don't get a good conversation, and you just get a check in the box kind of a conversation. So those things need to be factored in. Lastly, there has to be, at the very onset, a commitment from the mechanisms that they are going to address the harms and they are going to provide remedy, but at the same time, they're not going to put the complainants under any form of risk of retaliation or coercion all throughout the complaint process. I think because these assurances are not there upfront, you're not seeing complaints happening as much as they should. And we know this. In the AIB example, we have a situation in Indonesia. There's a tourism project which has had tremendous adverse impact on indigenous communities. But the local militarization is so deep and it's so risky that no community is going to step up and file a complaint. And there has to be some way where those complaints reach the mechanism. Because if you expect communities to somehow magically bypass the local risk scenario and reach the mechanism, that would be wishful thinking. So it's up to the mechanism to understand where are those fragile places, where are those conflict high risk places, and to anticipate. No? The IRM does a lovely job of self-triggering complaints, but not all mechanisms are up there. So that's the question. How will the other mechanisms fare up? I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I was just about to make that linkage that you did nicely at the end in terms of how mechanisms can provide the reassurance to complainants for a process that does not place them at risk. And if that cannot be assured, how can mechanisms provide solutions such as the self-initiated requests for or self-initiated work around complaint handling without the need for a complainant to come forward? So yeah, this is very interesting elements that you highlighted. We are running slightly slow on time, so I'm going to quickly move on to retaliation. So Tala will pass the floor over to you.
Yeah, also jumping off from Ryan's point as well, I think that's also one point that I think defenders also collectively raised, that it's important for the grams accountability mechanisms to have that power to self-initiate, to take action when they do have credible evidence and information that retaliation has taken place. Because when we speak of retaliation, that's also an evidence of a violation of the bank safeguard policies as well, if they especially when they do have a zero tolerance statement to retaliation. I think we also call on, and this is a big ask for accountability mechanisms and banks, is to do no harm. So we ask banks to commit to doing human rights due diligence, for accountability mechanisms to conduct a risk assessment. So as what Ryan was saying, there needs to be a proactive approach in ensuring that, and in certain contexts where there is no open space where communities can raise complaints and harm, mechanisms are there to to initiate these complaints on behalf of them, because we can't depend on we can't allow these harms to, and retaliation and reprisal cases to just happen when we can proactively initiate, and we know that there are these risks and harms that they are facing. Second is, I think Robin also mentioned it, is ensuring access for impacted communities. So there's really needs to be increased visibility, also information on what the bank can do in terms of security measures and security responses in terms of reprisals. Also ensuring that there is reprisal sensitive site visits for both outreach events and investigations and site visits, and ensuring that their visit to these impacted communities would not heighten risks for reprisals. Third is for accountability mechanisms to have a reprisal clear reprisal protocol and procedure when they do receive these cases. And once they receive these cases, that should trigger something already within these mechanisms in the banks to what the staff should do. How do we ensure security for these complainants and for these communities? How do we establish secure communication channels, that not just only with accountability mechanism, but even within the bank if there is a need. Also, how to independently verify information, because I've said there's also a conflict of interest. So there is a need to get information not from the clients and the partners that the projects are being implemented with, but also from the communities themselves that are facing these attacks. we also, I think there's also an ask for defenders for accountability mechanisms to recommend immediate measures to address reprisal concerns. So I think Pravin also mentioned this earlier, temporarily suspending financing or project implementation when there is, threats to lives and threats to safety of communities. And also the ability to recommend substantial and binding recommendations such as consequences for clients and governments that do partake in these attacks and violations of human rights. And lastly, defenders really call on these accountability mechanisms to provide support to defenders given their critical role in these development processes. They should be consulted on every step of the complaint process. They should be also consulted on how reprisals should be addressed because they are the ones who know their context the most and how which best action or mechanism should this bank and the mechanism should be implementing in order to increase their safety and security. There's also an ask for accountability mechanisms to have a fund, an emergency fund for defenders in cases of emergency assistance like hospitalization, bail fees, legal fees, etc. that they would need, and they would hopefully not need, but in cases of their attacks and threats, is an urgent resource that they would need in that regard. I think mechanisms also have the responsibility to push banks to use their leverage in terms of supporting defenders. Like, as I said, I think even just a public statement on denouncing retaliations and attacks on human rights defenders, they're linked to a certain project, or having specific consequences for clients, like putting them in having them in lists that they should not be given funding anymore, in terms of if they do are proven to attack and threaten these communities. And lastly, I think remedy should be delivered by the mechanisms and the bank as well. I think it should be in a collective and individual manner. And in cases of reprisals and retaliation, it should be determined by the defenders and their communities, and it should be proportional to the gravity of the harm that they suffered and restore them to their pre-violation condition. A lot of these recommendations also came from a learning circle that we did with defenders from Asia and the South Caucasus, and I can share with you the complete list. So these are just the main highlights of it. And yeah, I think I also look forward to discussion later. Thanks.
Thanks, Tala. Thank you for this shortened list of what was discussed. I would greatly appreciate that resource if possible, and I can even include it in our post blog summary if that's something you would like for us to do. We'll move on now to our last topic, remedy. Tanga, back over to you before we start the Q&A session.
Thank you. I think to uphold the best practices, GRM can take account of the intangible and non-economic aspects of the matter first, and then second, also to utilization of indigenous communication tools and capacity building and awareness raising outreach to the communities. And the third one is the multidisciplinary approach in remedy, to be able to look at the multiple side of the impact and the remedy. So it seems like a legal work, but also for us to be able to identify the multiple side of the impact, we really need the multiple approach and multiple expertise. And fourth is the utilization of or optimization of indigenous protocols of the communities that really helps a lot. And fifth is the mobilization of indigenous institutions on the ground. And finally, also IRM can apply proactive investigation, self-initiated investigation. Sometimes communities are not able to able to file the case or reach out to the IRM. So I think the self-initiated investigation is also a very good practice for IRM. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tunga, for a very concise response. So some of those considerations on remedy, especially the intangible and non-economic aspects, which you pointed out also in the first question. We have 10 minutes left for questions from the audience. So please raise your hand and then I'll call on you, or you can also put in your question in the chat and I'll read it aloud. I see one question from Faustina. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. One of the speakers, I think the lady, last but one, she mentioned something that was very significant, that does civil society even know that there's a project, GCF project going on in the first place? And so how do we monitor it? When we came from the training in Morocco, I wanted to bring together social civil society organizations, especially the grassroots ones, those who work in the local communities and all that, and to organize a training of them so that they'll be able to monitor, because we have, I think, 2 GCF projects going on in Ghana now. But I didn't know what to do, where to get the resources to bring them together in a one-day workshop, and then to empower them to go back and all that. And I want to find out how we civil society, I am a member of the WGC, so I'm always aware of the board meetings and the approval of projects and all that, so I can know in my country the projects that are going on. And then if I have trained these local civil society organizations, then I could share with them, and then they will start looking out and monitoring, you know, in the local communities. But how do we start it? Where do we get the resources? Is the GCF or the GRAM going to help us to be able to train the local civil society organizations to be able to undertake all this work? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Faustina. I have my own kind of semi-response to that, but maybe before we answer the question, we will get another one. Naomi, please go ahead.
Sorry, it doesn't. Hi. I'm a researcher. I study complaints mechanisms, among other things. My question is, and thank you, this was tremendous. It's really, really informative. My question really is, to what extent do you find that when you have a successful complaint, when a grievance is successfully addressed, that feeds back into policy, that actually that changes the ways in which the loans are being made, or the projects are being designed, or the partners that are being taken on? Does successful complaint actually change the policies of these institutions?
Very good question. I think that's I might let my colleague Preksha provide some of her views on that. But yeah, very insightful question in terms of what is the point of handling complaints if it can't have some longer term institutional structural changes, which I think is something that hopefully you would get insights from by handling complaints. But I'll let Preksha maybe respond to that. Our response to the first question about Faustina in terms of increasing awareness, I think accessibility is has many different components to it, especially in terms of how communities can become aware of mechanisms in the first place. And some of the things that you mentioned about wanting to do more engagements with communities in terms of a training. Just for some background information, the IRM, we held a workshop last April in Morocco with grievance redress mechanisms of the GCF, as well as civil society organizations that were located in Northern Africa and Western Africa. And Faustino was one of the participants in this, and we had different sessions with civil society where we talked about how we can increase awareness. And so I think some of those ideas that you're bringing forward now are really great. I think in terms of awareness raising, there's always work that can be done with some creative solutions to bring awareness to communities. And I think what was mentioned before in terms of some of the collaboration that can be done and the sharing of resources between GRAMS, civil society, other stakeholders to make that happen are really important. I will say on our side, in the past, one of the other elements that we had to increase awareness was an advocacy grant where we worked with civil society, provided funds so that they could work and continue kind of the increased awareness of the IRM. And we will be launching a new advocacy grant for those civil society organizations that have participated in our workshop in person. So just on the one-to-one side, Faustina, you will be receiving more information about that soon. Since you've participated in our workshop previously. But we do appreciate ideas in terms of how awareness can be reached to communities. And we really look towards civil society to come to us, have discussions with us on how that can be done. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers your first question. Are there any other civil society organization panelists that wanted to also respond to Faustina? Tanga, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Faustina. I think one of the other way also we could optimize or request some part of the funding under the country readiness support GCF provides to the countries, because one of the objective of the country readiness support is also the capacity building and also the coordination between NDA, civil society, right holders, stakeholders. So I think we can convince our government to allocate some of the money for capacity building around that. Thank you.
Great. On to the second question from Naomi, how a successful complaint could or does lead to policy changes. I'm going to hand the floor over to my colleague.
Yeah. Success, I guess the parameter here for success is that the harm was remedied via the complaints process. And learnings from doing so, going through this process, were then fed back into potential institutional policy changes. I'm probably not that cognizant of the whole landscape. There are other bigger institutions which with a much bigger caseload that can create kind of a more statistically significant analysis of how this actually translates into policy changes. IFC-CAO is one of them. But I think for the IRM, we have an advisory mandate. We do actively have a mandate to ensure that learnings, and they don't necessarily have to come from learnings from IRM cases, but that is the intention. In a kind of a critical mass of cases, not necessarily on a case-by-case basis, the IRM can issue an advisory to the board of the institution to take into consideration specific changes in policy. And it's a very formal process in which the Secretariat is queried and external stakeholders are brought in. We've issued that in one occasion on the necessity for a policy on sexual abuse, exploitation, and harassment. And that coincided with the GCF itself adopting a policy to that effect. And that came from learnings from very high-profile cases that other institutions had to handle and kind of very publicly endure quite a bit of scrutiny on the gaps and deficiencies in their policies and subsequent revisions to improve that. I think in general, if I can make it into the smaller IAM kind of policy world, for accountability mechanisms and their policies, it's been a evolution, right? Each mechanism goes through a routine policy review, and what works and what doesn't tends to feed into what the next iteration of that particular mechanism's policies might be. So, for example, if the IRM did not have a preliminary inquiry mandate, and then a policy review went through, and it was raised that this is something that other institutions have implemented, then it would be something that could be sequenced into a new IRM policy and structure. We do have that mandate, but just to say that, when institutions make those changes, then that can feed into it. On which mechanisms have substantive caseloads, which could help answer that question? I believe it's IFC, CAO, EBRD, their accountability mechanism, and EIB, the European Investment Bank. I also think the Inter-American Development Bank, MISI, their complaints mechanism should also have quite a bit of material on advisories. I'd also be curious to see if, from our civil society panelists, if anyone has had the experience of when you go through a complaint cycle, successful or not, that you've actually seen some tangible policy tweaks or changes as a result. I think, Ryan, probably you can unmute yourselves. Okay.
Well, I don't have a positive example. I've got a bad one. So back in the day when we were doing the Cambodia railway case in 2009, 10, and 12 onwards, they removed remedial action from the mechanism and gave it back to management, right, at the ADB. And that was a big loss. And that really affected how things played out in Tata Mundra when everything went back to management again. What we are feeling now, and the ADB accountability mechanism policy is up for review. And there's a big question around the Tanahu case and how the problem solving function was handled. And Praveen is here with years of battle on the ground on this. But what we really felt was management did play quite a lot of bias in the early days of the OSPF complaint, right? So there's this whole question around the structural independence of the problem-solving function. And our policy push in advocacy is to get it under the board compliance review committee structurally. But the reason why we're able to say that is because of the challenges that we faced in the Tanahu case, right? So hopefully we might win this one, but you never know. Mechanisms and banks.
Yeah,
Thanks, Ryan.
I'll just try to be very quick, Peter. I think Peter, Ryan has already touched on it, but again, I would not say success building from a complaint to a policy reform, but I think in the recent safeguards policy review of the ADB, having these complaints from indigenous communities calling for respect for their free, prior, and informed consent was one of the key issues that we discussed with the ADB safeguards policy review team, and that led to ADB safeguards now also being in line with other MDBs, multilateral development banks, to require FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent for certain project impacts that they finance. So I think yes, you can call it success, but I think it's also kind of sad that there has to be complaints to be made that for these banks, for these institutions to comply with international human rights standards. And again, as we are saying, there are still some banks, there are still many banks that do not even have those standards in line with their fellow banks. So yeah, I mean, I think more complaints need to be done, unfortunately, and more engagement need to happen. But again, for that, I would just touch upon there with the access to with the question about awareness raising or accessibility. For that to happen, for more complaints or for engagement to happen with these banks, with the mechanisms, there needs to be more awareness about these banks and safeguards and the mechanisms. And I cannot stress this enough, but I think the onus really lies on the banks or the institutions and the mechanisms themselves. The greater onus on the institutions, that they need to require their project implementing entities or their borrowers to aware the communities that these safeguards apply for these projects from the financiers, and there are these mechanisms of these financiers, financial institutions, that are an additional level of remedy or additional mechanism of remedy. So I think the biggest onus is on the banks or the institutions themselves. And as we already discussing, the mechanisms also need to take on a proactive role, that they go to the communities or they go at the national level, and hopefully with the civil society organizations like us, whereby we can bring you a greater circle, or like a wider circle of community level organizations from the areas where the projects being financed are being implemented, so that there is more awareness. No, I don't think the onus should be on civil society, and that is because we also don't have resources to be looking at each of the projects, particularly even when the disclosures are even difficult to scan through. Yeah, so yeah, the onus definitely is on the banks, the project implementing entities, and to a certain extent on the accountability mechanisms too.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I think we've run a little over time, so I'd like to maybe close out the session now. But I want to first thank all of our panelists, Preksha, Prabin, Rayan, Tala, and Tunga, for your insightful comments, looking at both the challenges and opportunities that GRAMs have when they engage with civil society organizations. I want to quickly have a reminder with the survey. If we can put that in the chat. It's a 1-minute survey, so it shouldn't take too long to fill out, and we really appreciate kind of your advice and inputs on how this webinar went today. And then lastly, we would like to take a group photo. So for those of you that would like to be in the photo, I encourage you to turn your camera on now. This photo will be used for some of our post-event communications, so there will be visibility of the people who decide to turn on their photo. And I kindly ask my colleagues to prepare a screenshot. So we will do a few. So we'll do 1, 2, 3. We'll do one photo. Do the screenshots, and we will do another one in just a second. So on the count of 3, we'll do another screenshot. 1, 2, 3. All right. And I think that covers it. So thank you all again for joining us today, and we will have the video and a recap of the event on our website in the coming weeks. So thank you for joining us. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.